It's taken a little bit for the live stream connection to build, but hopefully viewers start to join in now that we are online. And my opportunity is to be able to also check in with everybody on Facebook and see how it goes. Today there's a lot of activity going on in our education. We've got the beginning of our confirmation program. They are on Zoom with Pastor Woodfin. And so he actually went over to the school to have a better internet connection for his Zoom. I'm here in my office. After the 11 o'clock service, we have our first communion class starting. Next week, we have our first adult instruction class starting, Lutheranism 101. That will be done over Zoom between 10 and 10:30 as well. Pastor Woodfin will be leading that. Pastor Verge will be doing with confirmation. And then as all pastors will be taking turns with the first communion instruction. So we are, as much as we are trying and able, getting our education program for the fall up and going. I hope that if you want to be a part of a small group ministry, you're able to do that as well. Today's opening Facebook question, for those who are on Facebook and want to kind of add to the comments, is what vice, what temptation, what vice, what bad thing do you think is most susceptible to peer pressure? So as you think about the things that you've done wrong, or maybe those moments of temptation where you felt like seems like a lot of people are going this direction. Why don't I just go that direction too? Which temptation do you think is most susceptible to peer pressure? So which temptation do you think is easiest to give into because of peer pressure? That's our Facebook question of the day. Today our Bible study is on Matthew chapter 14. And in Matthew chapter 14, we will be reading about Herod Antipas. And we will have a little background of him. And we're going to start by reading that text. And so I'll have it next to me as I read. And it says, at that time, that, just to let you know, that's a phrase that Matthew will use a couple different times in his gospel to kind of show that everything that Jesus is doing is taking place in the context of a world where other stuff is also going on. So it's kind of like, meanwhile, if you could almost imagine, I think of like a soap opera that would have that interchange between this scene and that scene and this scene and that scene, a mosaic of different images. Meanwhile, well, Matthew says instead, meanwhile, he says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people, because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter. And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guests, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took the body and buried it. And they went and told Jesus. So, as people are answering on Facebook, our Facebook question of the day, what vice, what temptation is really a part of peer pressure, and you feel like just the whole river of momentum is going to do that thing. And some people have mentioned gossip and negativity and sex outside of marriage, and that all of those are, I think, are true temptations where it gets hard. The Bible study sheet for today, I've included some maps. This Bible study sheet can be found at ourshepherd.net as you are at the homepage, ourshepherd.net, and you go over to resources down to news. You'll find this Bible study sheet there available to download. It's lesson 36. We start with a map because Herod Antipas was the ruler of Galilee and Perea. And so Galilee is the area that is in purple, kind of north to the west of the Sea of Galilee. And then Perea is that area that's on the east bank of the Jordan River, and then around the Dead Sea. He's called a tetrarch because he controls a fourth of his father's kingdom. When Herod the Great we would read about in Luke chapter 2 at the time period when Jesus was being born, Herod the Great, when he died, his kingdom was split up into 4 parts. And by the time of Jesus, the part that's down by Jerusalem and Judea isn't controlled by any of Herod's descendants. Rome has taken over Jerusalem and Judea. But still, this part of the great kingdom of King Herod the Great is still controlled by Herod Antipas. Antipater is another one that he sometimes is referred to in history. A lot of the history we have about Herod Antipas comes from a Jewish historian that was working with the Romans named Josephus. And so Josephus was a Jew that provided history and context for the Romans so that as they controlled that area, they would know their people that they were controlling. And so we can read just not inside the Bible alone, but also outside of the Bible from the record of Josephus. His power in Galilee and Perea, his area of control was as a client state to the Roman Empire. He was called king. Sometimes he's known as Herod Antipas, King Herod, or Herod the Tetrarch. But his power is entirely as a client state. So that means that he is given the title and the power and authority to keep his area under control. But then he has to pay taxes, essentially, up to Rome. He divorced his first wife in favor of marrying Herodias. She had been previously married to Herod's half-brother. They shared a father, Philip and Herod, but they didn't share the same mother. This marriage to Herodias was not only something that John spoke about, it also resulted in a war that proved disastrous for Herod. Etnus, who was upset that Herod had divorced his sister, went to battle against Herod. Rome was also upset, and Rome's upset wasn't really about the morality of the marriage. Rome was upset because of the turmoil. You might have heard the term Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Rome just wanted calm so that trade could happen. And any time in one of their client states there was turmoil, that disappointed them. And so after Jesus' death, Herod Antipas is in this turmoil because Herod's first wife's brother is upset. There's a battle, there's war. And so Tiberius has ordered an attack. He's the emperor of Rome. But it was not carried out before his death in 37. In 39, he was charged with conspiracy against Rome and fled to Spain. And that actually came about from Agrippa, Herodias' brother, who Herodias had convinced Herod to help him out because Agrippa was in some debts. And so Herod Antipas helps out Agrippa, and then Agrippa kind of uses that relationship then to convince Rome that Herod is a man of conspiracy. Now, a little context about where John the Baptist was beheaded. It was at a palace named Macarius. Macarius is a fortified hilltop palace located in what is now modern Jordan, about 16 miles southeast of the mouth of the Jordan River. So if you see on the southern part of that map, the Dead Sea, that the north part of the Dead Sea is the mouth of the Jordan River. So the Jordan River flows north to south from Sea of Galilee down, empties into the Dead Sea. So 16 miles southeast from that Jordan River on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. And John had been in prison for about 2 years. And the timing of the execution of John is likely about 1 year before the crucifixion of Jesus. And John the Baptist's beheading. John the Baptist's execution would have been just shortly before Passover in the year 32. And a lot of our timelines for the execution of Jesus on the cross is 33 AD. So we're looking about 1 year before the crucifixion of Jesus. John the Baptist is beheaded. The same fortress, Machaerus, is where there was a siege by the Romans in 72 AD during the first Jewish revolt that began in 66 AD. So a little context. In 66 AD, there was a revolt that began up in Galilee with the Zealots, and they were upset over an issue of taxation without representation up in Galilee, and they revolted against Rome. Rome sent in soldiers to Galilee in the year 66. They put down the revolt largely in Galilee, but a lot of those zealots, which is a name for fanatics or people who are rebellious, the zealots from Galilee moved down to Jerusalem. They entered into Jerusalem, and then there was a conflict between the Sadducees that controlled Jerusalem and the temple, and the zealots that were starting to infiltrate there. And there was a civil war that took place in Jerusalem between the Sadducees and the zealots. And this is taking place between 66 and 70. And then the Romans finally enter in and they lay siege to Jerusalem. And many of the zealots then flee to the hilltop fortresses of Herod in Masada and in Machaerus. And in 72 AD, the Romans built an embankment, a ramp up towards this hilltop palace fortress to make room for their siege engine. So if you could imagine, the rebels are in this hilltop fortress, and they're there for a plan to, they've got water, they've got food, but all along they can look outside the walls and they can see the Romans filling the dirt in for this ramp. And up the ramp will go the catapults, the battering rams, all the siege engines. The Romans build this very big embankment to ramp up their siege engines. And just as the embankment is finished, the Jewish rebels surrendered. And this was one of the last strongholds. But then the very last stronghold was Masada. And there's kind of a lot of history about the final one. Masada is kind of like the Alamo in San Antonio, that sense of everyone fighting to the death and withstanding and making it as much as they could. So this gives you a little bit of background of who Herod Antipas is. Herod the Tetrarch, King Herod, who controlled Galilee and Perea. And he would be the one that was also then, a year later, he's in Jerusalem when Jesus is arrested, and Pilate hears that Herod is there, and he gives Herod an opportunity to interview Jesus. I always think it's interesting in Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice. Herod is kind of this Las Vegas singer that just wants to be wowed and shown great things. We're going to go now to the text itself. Matthew shows I hate typos. I use a computer that has autocorrect, and it says Matthew shows that the executive of John, well, it's meant to be, Matthew shows that the execution of John is not just another story of the cruelty of this world by bracketing the announcement of John with the news that Herod Antipas has heard reports about Jesus. So Matthew doesn't just tell us about the death of John. He does it by showing that John and Jesus are connected. We're going to look back to Matthew chapter 11, verses 6, verse 11 and 12, and we want to see how has Jesus been preparing his disciples for these kinds of times, at these times. So at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. Well, how has Jesus prepared his disciples for these kinds of times? So in in Matthew chapter 11, verse 6, it goes, "Blessed is the one who is not offended by me." So Jesus is equipping his disciples for a time when persecution will happen by saying, "Blessed is the one who isn't afraid of standing with me." And then let's look at verse 11. "Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist, yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force." So the image here is that at that time when there are rulers like Herod, Jesus is doing ministry. It reminds me that there has never been just kind of this utopian, perfect, peaceful moment in history. At that time, when Jesus comes and does his ministry, there are rulers like Herod. We could do the same today at that time and describe some evil, disastrous event that's going on in the world and yet say Jesus is doing ministry at this same time as well. Jesus has been preparing his disciples for these kinds of times by reminding them, don't be offended by me, stand strong, and that John the Baptist was great. But even the one who stands with me, who's least in the kingdom, is greater than he. Question 2. What is ironical about Herod thinking that Jesus is John revived from death? So John has been beheaded, and now news has come to Jesus, and Herod has heard about John. There's this news kind of going back and forth, and Herod thinks that Jesus is John revived. Well, the irony is that Jesus is the one that's truly going to be revived from the dead that can't be destroyed. All right, why did Herod arrest John? So this is question 3 in our study sheet, trying to get all lined up for us. So let's look to Matthew chapter 14, verses 3, 4, and 5. So as Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. So Herod is feeling pressure from Herodias because John had been saying to John has been saying to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. So there's our opening question is peer pressure and temptation, and you'll see already in verse 3, there's peer pressure for Herod to arrest John, and that peer pressure is coming from Herodias, his wife. And then there's peer pressure that's coming from the crowd, that Herod doesn't put John to death because he's fearful of the crowd. You'll notice that Herod is continually revealed to be a king who is motivated by trying to satisfy the nearest pressure that's on him. If the pressure is from Herodias, he's trying to favor her. If the pressure is from the crowd, he's trying to favor them. And when the pressure comes from the great noble guests at the party, we'll also see how that influences him. All right, now let's go. So we looked at why John gets arrested, and that's because John is telling the truth. And a king doesn't like to hear the truth. He'd rather have his wife happy than tell the truth. At Herod's birthday party, guests of high status were present. How is this going to influence Herod's actions? So let's look at the party. When Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod. And he had promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths, and his guests, he commanded to be given. So you see the peer pressure for Herod is he does not want to lose face among his guests. He has offered to give Herodias his daughter a prize, and when she asks for the prize, Herodias has entrapped her husband. Peer pressure for Herod is continually a problem. And part of the reason Herod continually struggles with peer pressure is that he does not internally hold on to his authority. He knows as a worldly king, his authority exists only as much as the people keep telling him he's in power. You see, our God is in power and authority. Whether we tell him he's God or not, he remains God. But Herod has no strength or conviction in his authority unless the people keep telling him. He is continually seeking the confidence of the people because he has no confidence on his own. He is just a client state to Rome, and he's a client state to the people. He doesn't lead on truth. He just leads on power. And Jesus is quite a contrast to the leadership of Herod. Jesus leads because he's God, and he knows what the people need. And whether the people walk away from him or not, he's continually going to move towards Jerusalem and be a sacrifice for our sins. And even on the cross, when all would abandon him, he still knows he has the power and the authority to be obedient to the Father. Matthew does not include the details about Herodias' daughter's dancing. We're left to fill in the gaps. Sordid or simply talented, we don't know. What kind of dance did she provide? Our minds and artists through the ages have often kind of illustrated it like a sort of belly dancing or something. This young girl and her mother spring a trap for Herod, enticing him and rejoicing in this dancing. Did Herod like the selection? Did Herod rejoice at the opportunity to find an entrance to kill Herod? Did Herod rejoice at the opportunity to kill John the Baptist? It's not really evident in the story that John is doing what he wants. It says, in fact, in verse 9, the king was sorry. So Herod has his own internal moral compass. He doesn't arrest John out of his own desires. He arrests John on behalf of his wife Herodias. Now, he's sorry, meaning his own internal moral compass, his conscience is letting him know that this is a bad action. But because he feels threatened in his power, he carries it out. Herod is a foil for us always to see how power that is gained through the acclamations of people is a dangerous kind of power, because it will lead to do and bring about a temptation to do things that are contrary to the moral code that God has written on us as the image of God. We're going to look at Psalm 2 now and see how the conflict between Jesus and Herod has been promised in the psalm. So we're going to look at Psalm 2. And in Psalm 2, you'll see in verse 2. So let's start at verse 1. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. Psalm 2, verse 2 has been seen by the church as speaking to the plot and divisions that Pontius Pilate and King Herod do during the crucifixion of Jesus. That we see King Herod and the rulers, Pontius Pilate, taking counsel together against the Lord, against the Messiah. That's what against his anointed. Think about against the Christ, against the Messiah, against the anointed. They all mean the same thing, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. So Psalm 2 is letting us know that God has seen and promised ahead for us. This is no surprise to Jesus. It's no surprise to God that the kings of this world, the rulers of the nations, they plot against the working of the Messiah. So as we see Herod, as we see John the Baptist, and we see this growing conflict, don't let it be a surprise to you this happens. And even in our own age, understand that there will be conflicts that happen between the power of the state and between the power of the church. And it is, in a way, kind of fruitless for us to expect always that the rulers of these nations around us, and even our own nation, will always be plotting with God. In fact, many times they may be plotting against God, and yet we will pray for them nonetheless. Question 7. The narrative ends quickly. Matthew chapter 14, we have this issue of Matthew retelling the story of Herod and the killing of John the Baptist. It kind of ends quickly. We don't have a lot of time reference. It doesn't say before Passover, or it doesn't say on the way to the feast. It just says at that time. That's how the story began, at that time. As Jesus is teaching and leading people through the understanding of the parables, at the same time the rulers are plotting against him. We don't know how long it would be for John's disciples to be able to bury the body, nor do we know when they make their way to Jesus. We don't know the timing. And the lack of timing in this narrative is kind of on purpose, because it lets us know that there's always a meanwhile. There's always a, at that same time, these things are going on. And so if you're in church and you're worshiping God and you're singing hymns and you're reading the scriptures and you're hearing a sermon, know that there is always a, at that same time, something evil is going on in this world. And we could, in response to that evil, like King Herod, be pushed to temptations and be pushed to vices. If we are seeking our authority and power in this world through the acclamation of the crowds, we'll always be susceptible to the things that are happening in the meanwhile moments, at that same time. How does Jesus react to the news of the death of John? Let's look to the ending of this section. In verse 12, his disciples came, took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. Now, verse 13. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him. So Jesus goes to a desolate place. There's a couple reasons for why Jesus could be going to this desolate place. First, he could be going to the desolate place simply because he wants to grieve. He's heard about the death of John, his cousin, and he's sad. It could also be that he goes to a desolate place because he does not know what the momentum of King Herod is at this moment. Is King Herod now also going to be seeking after Jesus? Because you see, verse 1, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus. Herod the Tetrarch knows about Jesus, and he is fearful that Jesus is John the Baptist revived from death. And so Jesus could be removing himself to a desolate place because it is not the right time for him to be arrested by Herod. He's been predicting all along that is supposed to take place in Jerusalem by the authorities, the religious leaders. Question 9. We do not know why God allows the evil authorities in this world to operate. Why is there at that same time stuff going on? We don't know why God makes his kingdom known in a way that are open to attack and apparently weak in comparison with the power of evil and ambition in men and women. The only answer given to God's operation in a world of evil could be seen. Look at this. I wrote by the sign of John. That word should be the sign of Jonah. So let's look at Matthew 28:38 to 40. How does the sign of Jonah remind us of why God would allow weakness to go on in this world? So then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks a sign, but no sign will be given except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. God allows evil and the ambitions of this world to operate in such a way that it will look like things are destroyed. Jonah was in the bottom of the sea. It was a destroyed moment, and we think that that's what's happening in the kingdom of God, that there are destroyed moments, that we are lost and we are forgotten and we are abandoned to the bottom of the sea. But then the great fish spit Jonah out, and Jonah began his mission work. In the same way, Jesus' ministry takes place in a world of evil and ambition of power and authority, and it may look like God is defeated. But in that weakness, we are reminded that there is no strength in this world of our own that can defeat the evil ambitions of others. We must rely purely and simply on the grace of God. All right, so that concludes our Bible study today. We will be looking more in Matthew chapter 14 and the feeding of the 5,000 next week. I'm glad everyone has joined and been a part of this Bible study. We had, I think, about 20 people watching on the different channels of streaming between Facebook, our website, and YouTube. Glad you are watching. All these Bible studies are available and easy to find again on our YouTube channel, which I think you'd find by ourshepherd.news/YouTube. Let's close with the word of prayer. Heavenly Father, give us the strength and conviction to know that our power, our authority in this world does not come from the acclamation of the crowds, but it comes from you. You are our strength, our majesty. You are our King, and we serve in your kingdom. In the name and the power of Jesus, amen. God's peace be with you. Glad you joined in this study.